The dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Texas, had seen their share of broken dreams and shattered hopes, but none quite like the story of Eleanor May Whitfield. In the summer of 1887, when the sun blazed mercilessly over the sprawling cattle ranches and the wind carried whispers of fortune and failure across the plains, Eleanor found herself standing at the crossroads of destiny. She was 22 years old, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and green eyes that held depths of determination her family had never bothered to notice. To the Whitfields, Eleanor was nothing more than a burden, a spinster daughter who had failed to secure a suitable marriage and had become the subject of cruel jokes at every family gathering. Her father, Samuel Whitfield, owned one of the smaller ranches on the outskirts of town, struggling to compete with the cattle barons who dominated the territory. Her mother, Margaret, spent her days lamenting Eleanor's unmarried status, comparing her unfavorably to her younger sister, Constance, who had married well at 18 and moved to San Antonio. Her brothers, Thomas and James, treated her like an unwanted guest in her own home, constantly reminding her that she was eating food that could go to more deserving mouths. The townspeople whispered behind her back, calling her Old Maid Eleanor, and speculating about what terrible flaw must keep such a reasonably attractive woman from finding a husband. But if you're enjoying this tale of resilience and unexpected love, please consider subscribing to our channel. We'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? Your support helps us bring more incredible stories from the American frontier to life. Eleanor had grown accustomed to the sting of their words, but it never stopped hurting. She spent her days tending to the ranch's books, managing the household, and caring for the animals with a competence that far exceeded that of her brothers. Yet her contributions were dismissed as women's work, unworthy of recognition or respect. The final blow came during a particularly harsh winter, when her father announced at the dinner table that he was considering sending her to live with distant relatives in Kansas, claiming he could no longer afford to support a useless mouth. The words cut through her like a cold blade, and that night, as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl across the prairie, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She had heard the stories about Jake "Thunder" Morrison, the wildest cowboy in 3 counties. He was a man who lived by his own rules, feared by some, respected by others, and desired by many women who would never admit it aloud. Jake owned a vast ranch called the Lightning Strike, earned through a combination of shrewd business dealings, incredible luck at poker, and a reputation for being faster with a gun than anyone foolish enough to test him. He was known for his black stallion, his silver spurs, and his complete disregard for social conventions. Most importantly, he was unmarried, and rumor had it that he was looking for a wife, not for love, but for practical reasons that had everything to do with expanding his territory and nothing to do with romance. The very idea of approaching such a man would have been scandalous for any respectable woman. But Eleanor had reached the point where respectability seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. She had watched her life slip away day by day, year by year, while her family treated her like a burden and society labeled her a failure. The thought of spending the rest of her days as a charity case in Kansas filled her with a desperation that overcame her fear. If Jake Morrison needed a wife for practical purposes, perhaps they could strike a bargain that would benefit them both. It was a dangerous gamble, but Eleanor had nothing left to lose. The morning she decided to act, Eleanor rose before dawn and dressed in her best blue dress, the one she had worn to church socials in the vain hope of attracting a suitable suitor. She braided her hair carefully, pinched her cheeks for color, and slipped out of the house while her family still slept. The ride to the Lightning Strike Ranch took her through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country in Texas, past rolling hills dotted with mesquite trees, and across streams that ran clear and cold from the distant mountains. As she rode, Eleanor rehearsed what she would say, trying to find words that would convince a man like Jake Morrison to consider her proposal without sounding desperate or pathetic. The Lightning Strike Ranch sprawled across the horizon like a small kingdom, with its impressive main house, numerous outbuildings, and corrals filled with some of the finest horses Eleanor had ever seen. Cowboys moved about their business with the easy confidence of men who knew their worth, and everything about the place spoke of prosperity and power. Eleanor's courage nearly failed her as she approached the main house, but the memory of her father's cruel words and her family's dismissive laughter strengthened her resolve. She had come too far to turn back now. Jake Morrison was exactly as intimidating as the stories claimed. He stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, dark hair that touched his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in a Dodge City saloon. When he emerged from the house to see who had come calling, his expression was one of mild curiosity, mixed with the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust unexpected visitors. Eleanor felt her mouth go dry as those gray eyes fixed on her, but she forced herself to dismount and walk toward him with as much dignity as she could muster. "Morrison," she began, her voice steadier than she had expected, "my name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I've come to discuss a business proposition with you." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness, and she caught a flicker of amusement in his expression. "Business?" he drawled, his voice carrying the hint of an accent that spoke of origins further south. "What kind of business would a lady like you have with a man like me?" The question wasn't mocking, but there was a challenge in it that made Eleanor's spine straighten. "The kind that could benefit us both," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I understand you're in need of a wife, and I'm in need of a husband. Perhaps we can come to an arrangement." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Jake studied her with those penetrating gray eyes, taking in everything from her carefully mended dress to the determined set of her jaw. Finally, he gestured toward the house. "Well, Miss Whitfield," he said, "I reckon we better discuss this inside. Can't have the whole territory talking about how Jake Morrison conducts his business negotiations on the front porch." As Eleanor followed him into the house, she couldn't help but notice the way he moved, with the fluid grace of a predator, every step calculated and controlled. The interior of the house surprised her with its understated elegance, furnished with pieces that spoke of good taste rather than ostentatious wealth. They sat across from each other in his study, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive oak desk. Jake poured himself a whiskey and offered her one, which she declined with a slight shake of her head. "Now then," he said, settling back in his chair, "suppose you tell me exactly what kind of arrangement you have in mind." Eleanor took a deep breath and launched into the speech she had rehearsed during her ride. She explained her situation with brutal honesty, her family's rejection, her lack of prospects, and her desperate need for a way out of her current circumstances. She outlined what she could offer him, her skills in managing a household, her education, her willingness to be a partner rather than a burden. "I'm not asking for love," she concluded, her cheeks burning with embarrassment but her voice remaining steady. "I'm asking for a chance to prove my worth as a wife and partner." In return, I can offer you respectability, companionship, and the kind of support that a man in your position needs." Jake listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass and studying her face. "You've got courage, I'll give you that," he said finally. "Most women wouldn't dare ride out here alone, let alone propose marriage to a man they've never met." He paused, then leaned forward slightly. "But courage isn't enough. This territory is hard on women, harder than you might imagine. Are you prepared for that?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Morrison, I've spent my entire life being told I'm not good enough, not pretty enough, not valuable enough to deserve happiness. I've been mocked, dismissed, and treated like a burden by people who should have loved me. If I can survive that, I believe I can survive whatever challenges this territory might offer." Something shifted in Jake's expression at her words, a flicker of understanding that surprised them both. "Fair enough," he said after a moment, "but I have conditions of my own. This would be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. I won't pretend to love you, and I won't expect you to pretend to love me. We'd be partners in business, nothing else." The words stung more than Eleanor had expected, but she nodded her agreement. "I understand," she said quietly. "When would you want the ceremony to take place?" Jake's smile was sharp as a blade. "Tomorrow," he said. "If we're going to do this, we might as well get it over with. The preacher in town owes me a favor, and I'm not a man who likes to wait once he's made a decision." Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat at the speed of his decision, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Tomorrow it is," she agreed, rising from her chair. "I should return home to prepare." "One more thing," Jake said as she reached the door. "Once we're married, you'll be Mrs. Jake Morrison. That name carries weight in this territory, but it also carries danger. There are men who would hurt you just to get at me. Are you prepared for that risk?" Eleanor turned back to face him, and for the first time since entering his house, she smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I've been hurt by people who were supposed to care about me. I think I can handle being threatened by people who were honest about their intentions." The wedding took place the next afternoon in the small church at the center of Copper Ridge. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, hastily altered to fit her smaller frame, while Jake appeared in a black suit that made him look more dangerous than any gunfighter's outfit ever could. The ceremony was attended by a handful of Jake's ranch hands and a few curious townspeople who had heard rumors about the unlikely union. Eleanor's family was notably absent. They had been so shocked by her announcement that morning that they could barely speak, let alone attend the wedding. As they exchanged vows, Eleanor couldn't help but notice the way Jake's hands remained steady while hers trembled slightly. His voice was firm and clear as he promised to honor and protect her, though they both knew the words were merely a formality. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jake's kiss was brief and businesslike, but Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her chest nonetheless. As they walked out of the church together, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was no longer Eleanor Whitfield, the unwanted daughter. She was Mrs. Jake Morrison, and that name meant something in this territory. The first few weeks of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Eleanor threw herself into managing the household with an efficiency that impressed even Jake's longtime housekeeper, Maria, who had been skeptical of the new mistress. Eleanor reorganized the kitchen, improved the meals, and began keeping detailed records of the ranch's expenses and income. She proved to have a keen mind for business, catching several discrepancies in the books that had been costing Jake money for months. Her suggestions for improving efficiency were practical and well-reasoned, earning her grudging respect from the ranch hands, who had initially viewed her as nothing more than the boss's latest whim. Jake, for his part, maintained the emotional distance he had promised, treating Eleanor with polite courtesy, but nothing more. He spent his days working the ranch, and his evenings in his study, emerging only for meals and the occasional business discussion. Eleanor told herself she was content with the arrangement, but she couldn't deny the loneliness that crept in during the long evenings, when she sat alone in the parlor, reading or working on her needlepoint, while Jake remained closeted away with his ledgers and correspondence. The first real test of their partnership came when Eleanor accompanied Jake to a cattle auction in the neighboring town of Red Rock. She had asked to come along, claiming she wanted to learn more about the business, and Jake had agreed with obvious reluctance. The auction was a rough affair, attended by hard men who conducted their business with a combination of shrewd calculation and barely controlled violence. Eleanor drew stares and whispers from the moment they arrived, partly because she was one of the few women present, but mostly because she was Jake Morrison's mysterious new wife. The trouble started when Silas Brennan, a rival rancher with a reputation for cruelty and a long-standing grudge against Jake, made a crude comment about Eleanor's appearance and speculated loudly about what kind of woman would marry a man like Jake Morrison. The insult was clearly intended to provoke Jake into a fight, but before he could respond, Eleanor stepped forward with a smile that was all sweetness and steel. "Mr. Brennan," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the auction yard, "I can see why you might be curious about my marriage, given that your own wife left you for a traveling salesman last spring. Perhaps if you spent less time gossiping and more time learning how to treat a woman with respect, you might understand what draws a lady to a real man." The silence that followed was deafening. Brennan's face turned purple with rage, while several of the other ranchers struggled to hide their grins. Jake's expression was unreadable, but Eleanor caught a glint of something that might have been approval in his gray eyes. "You'll regret those words, lady," Brennan snarled, but Eleanor didn't flinch. "I doubt that very much," she replied calmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, my husband and I have business to conduct." She took Jake's arm and guided him away, leaving Brennan standing alone in the middle of the auction yard, humiliated and furious. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Jake said quietly as they walked toward the auction ring. "Brennan isn't a man who forgets an insult." Eleanor looked up at him, surprised by the concern in his voice. "He insulted both of us," she said simply. "I wasn't going to stand there and let him get away with it." Jake studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. "But from now on, you don't go anywhere without one of my men as an escort." Brennan's the type to strike back when you least expect it. The protective note in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor's chest, though she tried to tell herself it was merely practical concern for his investment. The ride home from Red Rock was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than they had shared before. There was a new awareness between them, a recognition that they had stood together against a common threat and emerged stronger for it. That evening, instead of disappearing into his study as usual, Jake lingered in the parlor after dinner, eventually settling into the chair across from Eleanor with a book of his own. They read in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. As autumn painted the Texas landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor began to find her place not just in Jake's household, but in the broader community of Copper Ridge. She organized a church social to raise money for a new schoolhouse, charmed the wives of Jake's business associates, and gradually won over even the most skeptical members of the community. Her intelligence and wit made her a sought-after dinner guest, while her loyalty to Jake earned her the respect of his allies and the wariness of his enemies. The transformation wasn't lost on her family, who had initially been scandalized by her hasty marriage to a man with Jake's reputation. When Eleanor appeared at the annual Harvest Festival, wearing a beautiful new dress and jewelry that spoke of prosperity, accompanied by a husband who commanded respect wherever he went, the Whitfields' attitude began to shift. Suddenly, Eleanor was no longer the family embarrassment, but a valuable connection to one of the territory's most powerful men. Their attempts to reconcile with her were met with polite but distant courtesy. Eleanor had not forgotten the years of mockery and rejection, and she was not inclined to forgive easily. The first real crack in Jake's emotional armor came on a cold November evening when Eleanor fell ill with a fever that left her delirious and weak. Jake, who had maintained his distance throughout their marriage, surprised everyone by refusing to leave her bedside. He sat with her through the long nights, cooling her fevered brow with damp cloths and forcing her to drink water when she was lucid enough to swallow. When she finally broke the fever after 3 days, the first thing she saw was Jake's haggard face, his gray eyes dark with worry and exhaustion. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the fever. Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might deny it or brush off her observation with some practical explanation. Instead, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "You're my wife," he said simply, but there was something in his voice that made the words mean more than their marriage contract had ever intended. "I protect what's mine." The possessive note in his declaration should have offended her, but instead, it sent a warm flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with her lingering fever. As Eleanor recovered her strength, she began to notice subtle changes in Jake's behavior. He still maintained his emotional distance, but there were small gestures that spoke of growing affection. A hand on her shoulder as he passed her chair. A second cup of coffee brought to her without being asked. A new book left on her bedside table when he learned of her interest in poetry. These tiny kindnesses meant more to Eleanor than grand romantic gestures would have, because she knew they came from a man who didn't give his trust or affection easily. The winter of 1887 was harsh, with blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that dropped so low that the water in the horse troughs froze solid. Eleanor proved her worth during those difficult months, working alongside Jake and his men to keep the cattle alive and the ranch running. She learned to shoot a rifle, helped deliver a calf during a midnight snowstorm, and never once complained about the hardships or the danger. Her courage and competence during the crisis earned her the complete loyalty of Jake's ranch hands, who began to speak of her with the same respect they showed their boss. It was during one of those long winter evenings, as they sat before the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey and discussing plans for the spring roundup, that Jake finally began to open up about his past. He told her about growing up poor in Louisiana, about losing his parents to yellow fever when he was 16, about the years of hard work and harder choices that had brought him to Texas. He spoke of the loneliness that had driven him to seek a wife, not for love, but for companionship, and the fear that he was too set in his ways to ever be the kind of husband a woman deserved. "I never expected," he began, then stopped, staring into the fire as if the flames held the words he couldn't find. "I never expected to care," he finished quietly. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat at the admission, but she kept her voice steady as she replied, "Caring doesn't make you weak, Jake. It makes you human." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You're not what I expected either," he said softly. "When you rode up to my door that day, I thought you were just another desperate woman looking for security. I never imagined you'd become—" He trailed off again, but this time Eleanor didn't need him to finish the sentence. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities and unspoken feelings. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as Jake reached out to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Eleanor," he said, her name a question and a prayer all at once. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed as she felt the walls they had both built around their hearts beginning to crumble. When she opened her eyes again, Jake was closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath against her lips. The kiss, when it finally came, was nothing like the perfunctory peck they had shared at their wedding. This was a kiss full of months of suppressed longing, of growing respect and deepening affection, of two lonely souls finally finding their way to each other. Eleanor's hands fisted in Jake's shirt as she kissed him back with all the passion she had kept hidden, and she felt him groan against her lips as his arms tightened around her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the careful distance they had maintained for months lay in ruins around them. "This changes things," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor smiled, the first truly happy smile she had worn since childhood. "Yes," she agreed, "it does." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they shared more than just a name and a business arrangement. They shared themselves, completely and without reservation, and Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be truly wanted, truly valued, truly loved. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities to the Lightning Strike Ranch. Eleanor, now secure in her position as Jake's wife and partner in every sense of the word, threw herself into expanding their operations. She suggested they diversify beyond cattle, proposing that they invest in horses and even try their hand at farming some of the more fertile sections of their land. Jake, who had initially been skeptical of her business acumen, now sought her opinion on every major decision, recognizing that her fresh perspective and keen intelligence were valuable assets. Their happiness, however, was not destined to go unchallenged. Silas Brennan, still smarting from his humiliation at the Red Rock auction, had spent the winter plotting his revenge. He began spreading rumors about Eleanor's past, claiming that she had been involved in some scandal back in Copper Ridge that had forced her into a hasty marriage. The rumors were baseless, but they were persistent, and Eleanor began to notice the way some people looked at her when she came to town, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The situation came to a head when Brennan made the mistake of repeating his lies in front of Jake at the Copper Ridge Saloon. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Jake's fist connected with Brennan's jaw, with a crack that could be heard across the room, sending the older man sprawling across a poker table. "If I hear you speak my wife's name again," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet, "I'll kill you." The threat wasn't an idle one, and everyone in the saloon knew it. Brennan, blood streaming from his broken nose, scrambled to his feet and fled, but not before promising that Jake would regret defending his whore of a wife. The insult was the final straw. Jake's reputation for violence was well earned, and when word spread that Brennan had called Eleanor a whore, everyone in the territory knew that blood would be spilled before the matter was settled. Eleanor, however, had other ideas. She had not survived years of her family's cruelty and fought her way to happiness, only to see it destroyed by a bitter old man's jealousy. When Jake announced his intention to call Brennan out for a formal duel, Eleanor surprised him by asking to handle the matter herself. "This started because of me," she said firmly. "Let me finish it." Jake's initial reaction was to refuse. The idea of his wife facing down a man like Brennan was unthinkable. But Eleanor had learned to read her husband well, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. He knew she was capable of taking care of herself, had seen her courage and intelligence in action countless times. Finally, reluctantly, he agreed to let her try, but only if she would accept his backup plan if her approach failed. Eleanor's solution was both elegant and devastating. She had spent months building relationships within the community, and she used those connections now to orchestrate Brennan's social and economic destruction. She organized a boycott of his ranch, convincing other ranchers to refuse to do business with him. She spread word of his financial difficulties, information she had gleaned from careful observation and discreet inquiries, making it impossible for him to secure the loans he needed to keep his operation running. Most effectively, she enlisted the support of the territory's women, who were outraged by Brennan's crude behavior and eager to see him punished. Within 2 months, Brennan was ruined. His ranch hands had abandoned him for better opportunities. His creditors were calling in their debts, and he found himself completely ostracized from the community he had once tried to dominate. The final blow came when Eleanor arranged for the bank to foreclose on his property, using her influence and Jake's financial backing to ensure that the Lightning Strike Ranch acquired Brennan's land at a fraction of its value. It was a masterful display of strategic thinking and ruthless execution that impressed even Jake, who had never seen social warfare conducted with such precision. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," Jake said with genuine admiration as they watched Brennan's belongings being loaded onto a wagon for his departure from the territory. Eleanor smiled, but there was steel in her expression. "He threatened our family," she said simply. "I don't forgive threats to my family." The possessive way she said "our family" sent a warm glow through Jake's chest, and he pulled her close, marveling at the fierce woman he had married. As summer arrived, bringing with it the annual cattle drive that would take Jake away from the ranch for several weeks, Eleanor faced her greatest test yet. Jake was reluctant to leave her, worried about her safety and her ability to manage the ranch in his absence. Eleanor, however, was determined to prove that she could handle the responsibility. She had spent months learning every aspect of the operation, from the breeding schedules to the financial records, and she was confident in her abilities. The cattle drive departed on a bright June morning, with Jake leading a crew of 20 men and over 1,000 head of cattle toward the railhead in Kansas. Eleanor stood on the porch of the main house, watching until the dust cloud disappeared over the horizon, then turned her attention to the tasks at hand. She had plans for the ranch's improvement that she wanted to implement while Jake was away, projects that would surprise and delight him when he returned. Under Eleanor's management, the ranch ran with clockwork precision. She instituted new systems for tracking expenses and inventory, negotiated better prices with suppliers, and even managed to resolve a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher through careful diplomacy rather than the threat of violence that Jake might have employed. The ranch hands, initially skeptical about taking orders from a woman, quickly learned to respect her authority and appreciate her fair but firm leadership style. The real test came when a group of rustlers attempted to steal horses from the lightning strike corrals on a moonless night in July. Eleanor, awakened by the sound of nervous horses, grabbed Jake's rifle and crept out to investigate. What she found was 3 men attempting to cut the fence and drive off some of Jake's prize breeding stock. Without hesitation, Eleanor fired a warning shot over their heads, then called out in a voice that carried clearly across the yard, "You have 10 seconds to get off my land before I start shooting to kill." The rustlers, expecting to find the ranch defended only by a skeleton crew of cowboys, were shocked to hear a woman's voice. Their shock turned to alarm when Eleanor's second shot took the hat off the leader's head, demonstrating that her marksmanship was as good as her word. 5 seconds, she called out, and the rustlers decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They fled into the night, leaving behind their tools and their dignity. The story of how Mrs. Jake Morrison had single-handedly driven off a gang of horse thieves spread throughout the territory, adding to her growing reputation as a woman not to be trifled with. When Jake returned from the cattle drive in late August, he found a ranch that was more prosperous and better organized than when he had left. Eleanor had not only maintained everything in his absence, but had actually improved upon it, increasing their profits and expanding their influence in the territory. More importantly, she had proven to herself and to everyone else that she was truly Jake Morrison's equal partner, not just in name, but in deed. The reunion between husband and wife was passionate and joyful, with Jake sweeping Eleanor into his arms and spinning her around on the front porch, while she laughed with pure happiness. "I missed you," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he set her down and cupped her face in his hands. "I missed you too," she replied, and the simple words carried the weight of all the love they had found together. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake took Eleanor's hand in his and spoke the words that had been growing in his heart for months. "I love you," he said simply. "I know that wasn't part of our original agreement, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just a business arrangement. You're everything I never knew I wanted, everything I never thought I deserved." Eleanor felt tears of joy spring to her eyes as she turned to face him fully. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling in love with you that first day when you looked at me and saw something worth taking a chance on." As autumn returned to the Texas plains, Eleanor reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from the unwanted daughter of a struggling rancher to the beloved wife of one of the territory's most successful men. She had been mocked as worthless by her own family, dismissed as a failure by society, and written off as a hopeless spinster. But she had refused to accept their judgment, had taken control of her own destiny, and had found not just security, but true love with the wildest cowboy in the territory. The Whitfield family, who had once treated Eleanor with such cruelty, now found themselves on the outside looking in. They had lost not just a daughter and sister, but a connection to power and prosperity that they desperately needed. Eleanor's success served as a constant reminder of their own failures, and the knowledge that they had driven away the very person who might have saved them from their declining fortunes was a bitter pill to swallow. But Eleanor had moved beyond the need for their approval or their regret. She had found her place in the world, had proven her worth, not just to others, but to herself. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had ridden out to the lightning strike ranch with nothing but desperation and hope. She was Mrs. Jake Morrison, a woman of substance and influence, a partner in one of the most successful ranches in Texas, and most importantly, a woman who was deeply and truly loved. As winter approached once again, Eleanor stood on the porch of her home, watching Jake work with the horses in the corral below. Her hand rested on her still flat stomach, where their first child was just beginning to grow. She had not yet told Jake about the baby, wanting to be certain before she shared the news, but she knew that when she did, his joy would match her own. They had built something beautiful together, something that had started as a desperate bargain and had grown into a love story that would be told for generations. The wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle lowing, the eternal music of the Texas plains. Eleanor smiled as she watched her husband, this man who had taken a chance on a woman the world had written off, who had seen value where others saw only failure. She had risen from the ashes of her family's rejection to become the bride of the territory's wildest cowboy. And in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most unlikely partnerships. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the horizon, promising rain for the thirsty land. Eleanor laughed softly, thinking of how appropriate it was that she had married a man called Thunder, a man whose love had transformed her life, as surely as rain transformed the desert. She had been mocked as worthless, but she had proven them all wrong. She had found her worth in the arms of a wild cowboy, and together they had built an empire of love and prosperity that would endure long after the mockery of her past had been forgotten. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Eleanor went inside to prepare dinner for her husband, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected turns that had led her to this moment. She had gambled everything on a desperate plan, and she had won more than she had ever dared to dream. The worthless daughter had become a treasured wife. The family failure had become a territorial success, and the woman who had been mocked for her lack of prospects had found the greatest prospect of all, true love with the wildest cowboy in Texas.